Black unmarried twins made the highest bid on a farm at auction. Without realizing that their devastating truth would change everything, the auctioneer looked at the raised hand. He paused. He looked again, as if the hand could be wrong, as if a black arm in the air at a rural auction in the Georgia countryside with 340 acres up for grabs and the Aldrich family on the other side of the room were some kind of optical illusion. Something that would correct itself if he waited another 2 seconds. Dominique Reed didn't lower her arm. She didn't blink. She didn't turn her face away. She stayed exactly where she was, in the middle of those white plastic chairs, lined up in a barn that smelled of old straw and diesel, with the auctioneer's brother jotting down numbers on a brown clipboard that was peeling at the edges. And she waited. The number she had called out was real. It was the highest bid of the afternoon, and everyone in the room knew it. Look, there's something specific that happens when someone who shouldn't have money shows they have money. It's not surprise. Surprise has a spark of admiration. What happened in that warehouse was different. It was that particular silence that precedes questioning. The kind of silence that asks without opening its mouth, "Are you sure you know what you're doing?" Celeste, the twin, was sitting 2 seats to Dominique's left. She didn't raise her hand at any point. She held a brown folder on her lap, thick, secured with a double elastic band, and her fingers were crossed over it with a calmness that was almost disconcerting. Her eyes weren't on the audience. They were on Warren Aldrich's face. And Warren Aldrich hadn't noticed that yet. What happens next, and here, I need you to pay attention, begins at that very second. The second the auctioneer resumes the count. And Warren rises from his chair with a smile that wasn't one of joy. It was something older than that. The kind of smile that says, "I know how this ends and you don't." But there's a scene, and it comes later in this story, of Celeste Reed with that same brown folder open on a table, reading a specific line in a document that was 15 years old and slowly closing her eyes like someone who can finally breathe after a long time without being able to. You need to understand what was in that document. And to understand that, you need to know where these 2 women came from. If you're just getting into this story now, subscribe to the channel because it goes deep. Dominique and Celeste Reed grew up in a county where land was currency, and that currency rarely reached people who looked like them. Their mother, Irene Reed, worked for 22 years as a sharecropper on a property 12 kilometers away. Not the Aldrich farm, but close enough that the name Aldrich was familiar from childhood, spoken by adults with that neutral tone that children learn early on isn't neutral at all. Irene died 3 years before that auction. She left her daughters a savings account, a box of documents, and a phrase that Dominique repeated to Celeste every time things got tough. Land doesn't lie. It's the only business that doesn't disappear when you sleep. Dominique went to Atlanta. She worked in finance for 10 years. She built something. Celeste went north, earned a master's degree in land law, specialized in rural properties with a history of litigation, and came back. It was Celeste who found the auction notice. It was Celeste who spent the next 8 months examining every deed record for the Aldrich farm available in the county archives. Every transfer, every clause, every footnote that normally doesn't interest anyone because people who buy farms aren't lawyers specializing in land law. Warren Aldrich knew none of this. He knew that 2 black women had shown up at his auction with enough money to make the highest bid, and that in itself was problem enough for him. The auctioneer confirmed the amount. He wrote it down. He brought down the hammer. Warren stood up before the sound had faded. It wasn't to greet him. His path, cutting diagonally across the warehouse, ignoring the 2 rows of chairs, heading straight for the auctioneer with his hand on the man's shoulder as if reclaiming an object. That wasn't a reaction. It was protocol. Warren had made that move before with other people. In other situations, he knew exactly how much weight his hand carried on the shoulder of a man who had owed favors to the Aldrich family for 2 generations. Dominique saw it all. Her jaws clenched. She breathed in through her nose once, twice. Celeste didn't move. What Warren did over the next 48 hours was methodical. You need to understand this. It wasn't anger. It wasn't impulsiveness. It was calculation. He knew the levers. He knew who to call. He knew that the local registry office had an employee who understood that certain paperwork took longer to process when certain people were the applicants. He knew that the regional bank where the Reeds had an account was headed by a man who played golf with him every Thursday morning. The day after the auction, Dominique received a call from the bank. A funds verification, standard procedure, they said. She'd been through this before in other real estate transactions. It had never taken more than a day. This time, it took 4 days with the deed on hold. 4 days during which Warren shuttled between the registry office, the bank, and the local lawyer's office with the energy of someone who genuinely believes he is restoring the natural order of things. On the third day, Dominique was sitting in a plastic chair, plastic again, white again, this time in the registry office hallway, waiting for an update that never came, when Warren's assistant walked past her without slowing down and said to no one in particular, in a voice loud enough to be heard, "It'll work out. These things always work out. These things." She stared at the empty hallway after he left. The wall in front of her had a poster for a vehicle registration service. A photo of a smiling family. The family was white. That wasn't an important detail. And yet, it was the only detail on the wall. What Warren didn't account for, what he couldn't have accounted for because he didn't know Celeste existed as an operational force in that transaction, was that Celeste wasn't waiting in the hallway of any registry office. Celeste was in her office in Atlanta on the phone with the Georgia State Department of Historic Property Records, confirming something she had known since the previous month, but which needed one last verification before she could use it. The property was not what Warren had put up for sale. Not entirely. And there lies the detail. The detail Warren spent 15 years assuming no one would find. The history of the Aldrich farm began in official records in 1987. 420 original acres purchased by the family with federal funding. In 1991, 80 acres were sold to a third party. In 2009, a deed split reduced the property to 340 acres, the number listed in the auction notice. Celeste had read that document 200 times and she had read just as often the original 1987 document. The document that listed in the land use restrictions section a reversion clause that stated in dense 1987 legal language that any subdivision or partial sale of the property within the first 30 years of ownership required formal notification and approval from the State Land Development Office. An office that had been reorganized in 1998, renamed in 2003, and whose records had been only partially digitized. The sale of 80 acres in 1991. No notification, no approval, made 4 years after the original purchase within the 30-year window by a man who assumed and was likely correct in that assumption that no one would look. This made the 2009 deed split legally contestable, which made the 2024 auction legally contestable, which meant that if Warren managed to invalidate the Reeds' bid through technical means or local pressure, something he was trying to do at that very moment with the help of the bank and the county recorder's office, the Reeds had grounds to challenge not only the bid, but the validity of the very property he was selling. Celeste had known this since October of the previous year. She hadn't told Dominique, not completely. She had said, "It'll work out. Place the bid, I'll take care of the rest." Dominique had placed the bid. And now, with the deed stalled for the 4th day, and Warren Aldrich making calls across the county, Celeste looked at the phone, typed a 3-word message to her sister, time to use it, and made the call she had mentally scheduled months ago. Not to the local county clerk's office, to the Georgia Attorney General's office, Rural Property Litigation Division, to a lawyer named Audrey Alvarez, whom Celeste knew from grad school, and who had spent the last 6 years building a portfolio of cases exactly like this one. And this is where the story takes a turn. What happens next makes all of this seem like a warm-up. Audrey Alvarez arrived in the county on a Wednesday morning with 2 assistants and a briefcase 3 times as thick as Celeste's. She didn't go to the county clerk's office first. She went to the bank's office, not to negotiate, to serve notice. The notice was formal, dated, signed, and informed the bank president that the transaction in question, the suspension of the Reeds' funds verification, was being included as part of an investigation into bid rigging based on documentation demonstrating a pattern of coordinated behavior between private parties and public officials. The bank president read the document twice. That same afternoon, the verification was completed. The Reeds' funds were confirmed. Warren Aldrich received a copy of the notification from Audrey in his office at 4 in the afternoon. He sat staring at that paper for a time his assistant later described as too long to be comfortable. The printout in front of him was 15 pages long. Most of it was a history of records, dates, file numbers, cross-references between documents from 1987, 1991, and 2009. On page 11, there was a paragraph describing the 1987 reversion clause in plain language, without jargon, written to be read by someone who wasn't a lawyer. Warren was the son of a man who had bought that ranch. He had grown up on that land. He had inherited the business, the contacts, the assumption that certain things were handled in certain ways because they had always been handled that way. He had no idea that the original deed contained that clause. Or maybe he knew on some distant level and had assumed, just as his father had assumed in 1991, that no one would look deep enough to find it. The problem with assuming that no one will look is that you stop behaving like someone who might be seen. The room where Warren read that document smelled of stale coffee and forced air conditioning. The kind of smell that lingers. The kind that, months later, when you remember that specific moment, is the first detail that comes back. Celeste Reed was 40 minutes away at a conference table in Audrey's office with the brown folder open in front of her and the original 1987 document printed on archival paper, yellowed at the edges, small font, the kind of thing that spends decades in the archives waiting for someone to have the reason and the means to find it. She read the line of the reversion clause aloud, slowly. Then she closed her eyes. Dominique was sitting beside her. She said nothing. She placed her hand over her sister's. They stayed like that for a moment that needed no words at all. The deed to the farm was transferred to Dominique and Celeste Reed 31 days after the auction. The lawsuit Audrey filed challenging the 1991 sale resulted in an investigation by the state office that led over the following 12 months to a complete review of other transactions by the Aldrich family during the same period. It is not the scope of this story to detail every consequence. Some were still unfolding as this narrative was put together. What matters here is something else. Warren Aldrich sold the farm because he needed cash. The business the family had built on that land had shrunk over the past 10 years in a way he hadn't told anyone about. The 340 acres were the main asset. Selling them was the final move before formally acknowledging that the cycle had ended. He needed a buyer who wouldn't ask questions. He hadn't counted on buyers who already had the answers. Dominique spent the first week after the transfer walking the property's boundaries alone, early in the morning, in borrowed boots that were a size too big for her, stepping on the ground damp with dew. 340 acres is a distance you don't understand until you walk it. She walked. It wasn't sentimentality. It was verification. It was the kind of thing someone does after spending 4 days in a notary's office, hearing that it would work itself out, and surviving to be on the other side. Celeste didn't go for a walk. Celeste stayed in the makeshift office they'd set up in one of the smaller buildings on the property and spent the week finishing the paperwork the state office still needed. Her work hadn't ended with the transfer. In fact, in a sense, it had only just begun. One afternoon that week, Dominique returned from her walk and found Celeste still in the same position as hours earlier, hunched over the desk, reading, making notes in the margins with a red pen. The brown folder lay beside her, secured with a double rubber band. Outside the window, the sun was low, and the countryside had that specific late afternoon color, golden and still, the kind of stillness that doesn't exist in Atlanta. Dominique stood in the doorway for a second. She wanted to say something. Something about the land, about their mother, about what it meant to be there after all. But she didn't, because Celeste already knew. They were twins. They shared the language of siblings who grew up carrying the same burdens. And in that language, sometimes simply standing in the doorway was the whole sentence. Celeste looked up. She looked at her sister for a second. She went back to the papers. Dominique came in, pulled up a chair, and sat down beside her. 2 black women at work on a farm that was now theirs. It wasn't victory. It wasn't relief. It was something harder to name. The specific weight of having arrived at a place that cost what it cost and discovering that the weight doesn't go away just because you've arrived. It changes shape. It gets smaller or more manageable or sometimes just different, but it stays. The land doesn't lie. It was the only thing that doesn't disappear when you sleep. Irene Reed had said that. And now her daughters were sitting on a 340-acre farm in rural Georgia with papers proving the land was theirs, and the weight of everything it had taken to get there was real and present and wasn't going to be resolved with an auctioneer's gavel or a deed of conveyance. Some things get resolved, others simply change addresses.